Robin, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to talk. Thank you.
Likewise.
We're here at a conference that's celebrating confluence. And it struck me as I was looking at your bio that you're kind of a living example of confluence. You're a botanist,
Yes.
a philosopher, natural historian, Native American mythologist, writer. You bring together a lot of things in your life and in your work. How did that come to be? How is it that you've got fingers in so many different pies?
Oh, what a good question. And it hasn't always been that way. I think it's been, for me, a journey circling around to wholeness. Because, when we're children, we don't make those distinctions, do we?
No.
Between poetry and nature and science and art. We just don't. But I remember very distinctly when I was going to college that I had to decide whether I wanted to be a poet or a botanist. And it was, to me, striking that you had to choose. Why couldn't you do both?
Yeah.
But the academy does not encourage that, and especially not in the sciences. Once I chose the path of plant sciences, a lot of other pathways closed. And so it has, including the pathway of bringing indigenous knowledge with me into the scientific world. So there's a way in which my writing, my teaching, my research has been a process of remembering, bringing all those pieces back to wholeness.
Well, how have you managed to overcome the sort of institutional bias against that very thing?
I'm not sure that I have. I have for myself, but within my own institution, there is still a great privileging of the Western scientific ways of knowing. There's room now. There's room around the edges for other ways of being, but I think that in terms of institutional change, I would say that the window has been opened just a little bit and the breeze is starting to come through, and what's really going to propel it is students, because our students are coming from a much more integrative perspective than their teachers and their institutions.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's a very hopeful thought.
It is, yeah.
How is it that you think that's happening? How are they being exposed to something that's more integrative, as you say, than we were?
I think it has a lot to do with the diversity of peoples that our students are exposed to, and lots of different ways of being in the world that earn respect, and they began with tolerance, right? And it's gone far beyond this notion of we ought to tolerate other ways of being to we ought to embrace them.
Right.
And I'm envious, really, of students who have come up in a world which is so open and receptive to difference, that celebrates it. So I think that's one of the things that has really moved the needle on, that the students are bringing that kind of energy and enthusiasm for other ways of being.
Well, your book title, Braiding Sweetgrass, so beautiful. That's also a picture of confluence as well, right? What is it that convinced you so strongly that we must braid together traditional scientific knowledge with indigenous ways of knowing, but also the arts? What brought you to that place where you said, we can't treat these separately anymore?
For me, a really pivotal time in doing that was that I had spent decades on my knees before mosses, the most overlooked beings in the plant kingdom. They had become my teachers. They're extraordinary beings that no one even pays attention to. And I looked at I guess you'd call it my body of work, and said, oh, those are very nice scientific papers about the life of mosses. But I felt in a way that I was betraying them, because they had taught me so much, and I was forced through writing peer-reviewed scientific articles to reduce what they had taught me to p-values and data tables and graphs, and it seemed dishonest. Isn't that strange? That, you know, by using these tools of objective science, I felt like I couldn't tell the truth. And so
peer-reviewed, but
right,
dishonest,
because I was telling only this much of what I had learned, and in a language which excluded the world from really celebrating mosses, because you know, who's going to read that? We're not. So I wanted to tell the truth about mosses, and I wanted their teachings that had been shared with me. I understood the tremendous privilege of having been their student, and that I wanted to open that door to other people. So it really was an impulse toward telling the truth and realizing that science has this much of the spectrum of truth, and that I needed different tools to open peoples to the beauty and the teachings of plant world.
Well, and that brings us back to poetry in so many ways, but also a different way of seeing these other beings.
Yes.
I was also struck in your conversation 2 nights ago by this very poignant question. You brought up the idea that we're suffering from a crisis of loneliness in human culture, and we're seeing the effects of that everywhere. But you went a step further that I'd never heard before, and that is, what if the natural world is also lonely for us?
Yeah.
But that implies a level of consciousness, a level of self-awareness, a level of feeling that seems to be what the traditional scientific mindset is wanting to exclude.
Yes.
How did you come through a very traditional education where you had to play within those boundaries? How did you come to that place where you could open up and allow plants and animals to be something other than objects?
Because that way of understanding the rest of the living world as our relatives, not as ecosystem entities, not as things, but as beings, is foundational to Indigenous ways of knowing. That's how I grew up. I understood the beingness of trees and grasses and berries and streams. And there's a way in which science, institutional science, tried to make me forget that, to say, like, that's not welcome here. You may not bring that here. But it was always within me. And it was within me not only because of the Indigenous values that I grew up with, but that's what the land says to you all the time. If you're paying attention to the land, you know the land is not things. You know the land is not objects. It's made up of companions and other beings. So I think it was trying to reclaim what I always knew, what the land had always been telling me. And I thought, no, in order to tell the truth, I need to bring this lens as well as the scientific lens. And that's why that book title really has 3 strands of knowledge. There's 2 human kinds of knowledge: Indigenous science, Western science, which are both ways that human people try to make sense of the world. But the plants are the ones who already know. You know, to say that we're the only ones that have knowledge, no, that's what that 3rd strand is the knowledge of the plants themselves. And we have to be able to use and cultivate those, the tools to be able to try to discern what the plants are bringing to us.
So how do you introduce that into the conversation with traditionally trained scientists? How do you say to those people, no, you really need to listen to what these plants are saying? What experience, what tools need to be imparted in order for them to be able to do that? Are you working that angle of the problem?
Well, one of the things that I have found in always swimming upstream, really, in the scientific worldview, is deep skepticism that talking about plants or insects or birds as persons rather than things is often thought to be, I'm going to use the word supernatural, right? And what I try to convey is it's not supernatural. It's natural. These are natural phenomena that we don't understand yet. I'm not trying to invoke something that is outside the realm of the natural world, but to say that because with science, with the ways that we measure and observe and privileging the intellect over all other ways of knowing, we've allowed our faculties, or sort of like our muscles, to atrophy. Our intuitive muscles have atrophied because we don't use them. But within the indigenous tradition, the teachings, the stories are that everybody understood what the birds were saying to you. And that's not supernatural, it's natural, and you had cultivated a facility to do that. Just like, you know, those ancestors wouldn't know how to use a cell phone, but we don't know how to use that mode of communication of listening to birds or listening to plants. So to me, it's absolutely natural. We don't understand it yet, but just because we don't understand it, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You know, gravity existed long before Newton gave it a name.
Right, and acted upon things all around us.
That's right, right.
The question that comes to my mind with that idea, though, is it retrievable for people who did not grow up hearing those kinds of stories? On any kind of time frame, time scale that matters given the state of the world today. What do you think?
What a good question. I think that our human capacities to pay attention are inborn, right? Our capacities to pay attention, to distinguish this from that, benefit from harm, all of the distinctions that we make in both the built environment and in the living world, we have those facilities. But in a sense, we've allowed them to be hijacked by corporate America. They've been hijacked in a way by literacy, by lots of interventions, cultural interventions, but our abilities to pay attention and to discern are still there. So I think that it can be taught. I think that if you try, there's some unlearning that has to happen. Principally the unlearning that's not possible. You have to embrace the possibility of the agency and personhood of the world. And once you start looking at the world through a lens of personhood, it becomes real noisy out there. There's a lot of persons needing to be heard. So I don't know that, is it irretrievable? That's such a poignant question. I don't know. I don't know. But I believe that we have the capacity, and if we turn the capacity to that question, then we will learn. And we have to turn our attention that direction in these urgent times, you know. When you think of all our plant and animal relatives leaving us in the age of the sixth extinction, you think of the world on fire. What better thing to be paying attention to than the teachings of the land?
Well, and paying attention is the right phrase. My wife and I just made a cross-country trip through the swamps of Louisiana and Mississippi, and we suddenly noticed that there weren't as many bugs on the windshield. That's a kind of paying attention that anyone can do and say, wait, something's different, something's wrong.
Right.
Do you see evidence that, you described it as the window in the academic world being just a little bit open and the fresh air coming in. Do you see evidence that average people are beginning to entertain the idea that there's more to the world than clock parts, as we were all taught?
Yes. I think for me, one of the pieces of evidence of a changing consciousness about our relationships to the living world are coming in the rights of nature movement, which, as you perhaps know, is this emerging jurisprudence that is based on the paradigm that the living world is not our property, that it's not property at all, that they are beings, sovereign beings who have their own rights and responsibilities. And the growing wave of communities who are saying, we're going to designate our lake, our river, our mountaintop as a person and convey to them the rights of personhood is exceptional. I mean, we live in a country where the only beings who get to have personhood are human beings and corporations. and I think people are pushing back against that, yes, to say we need to have the same kind of regard for the living world around us, mm-hmm, whether you think about them as fully conscious, sentient beings or not. Mm-hmm. They are still beings, they're entities worthy of respect who absolutely support our lives. We need to support theirs, mm-hmm, as well. And to me, this is an example of where the indigenous worldview and the Western worldview are starting to meet, mm-hmm, because this idea of personhood is deeply embedded in the indigenous worldview, and the idea of property law in Western worldview put those things together to give rights to nature. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's very hopeful. Is that in the consciousness of a mainstream average American? Probably not yet. But mm-hmm, it's happening in all kinds of communities at the grassroots level. So to me, it's one example.
Well, some of those communities have to hold referenda in order to grant the lake.
Yes.
And so at least there's that conversation going on.
Yes, absolutely.
And I interviewed a gentleman who was on the legal team that brought the first lawsuit seeking to grant personhood to the Colorado River.
Oh, wonderful.
They lost, of course, in the first round.
First round.
But
yep,
the point is the conversation began and
yes,
will continue.
Yes.
But in that conversation, I was struck that many of these communities that you're talking about are in indigenous cultures around the world, but a lot of them are right here in the United States.
Yes.
We're talking about traditional towns and cities in the U.S.
Right, right. Who have found themselves under assault from the paradigm of land as property, land as private property, land which can be taken from you to serve the needs of corporations rather than serving the needs of the human community and the needs of the biotic community. When we start talking about, well, you know, the Klamath River, people are arguing all about, well, the water needs to be there for farmers. Okay. Well, the water needs to be there for salmon too. And this expanding consciousness of the needs of all beings is, I think, really hopeful.
Mm-hmm. And so, in the academic world, so much of what we try to do is focused on getting people to know things, so that perhaps they'll do things. But would you agree that there's a step before that, and that is getting them to feel something?
Yes.
If you had the power to make average people, or academics too for that matter, policymakers, politicians, feel something in the direction of wholeness, mm-hmm, what would it be?
Two things, I think. One is to feel love for the world. And the other one is to feel love from the world. To know that this innate biophilia that we are all born with, this love and attraction to the living world, which is really also an attraction to ourselves because we are the living world. Mm-hmm. And because as human people, in loving families and in loving communities, we know that love comes, there's a reciprocal cycle there, that when we love, we hope are loved in return, and that love comes with a responsibility. And I don't mean this kind of romantic notion of love. I mean the kind of love that's work, that says, I care for you, therefore I'm going to take care of you. And the reciprocal of that, to know that we love the world, but when you turn it around, that the world loves us back, that is a whole nother set of responsibilities, isn't it? Because when we feel that the world loves us, as, you know, it's why we call her in our culture Shkakmikwe, it's why we call her Mother Earth, because she loves us. The evidence is all around us. She feeds us, you know, she delights us, she teaches us, she gives us a swat when we need it. You know, she is always caring for us, and those are the hallmarks of love from the earth. And when we have that bond of loving the world and being loved by the world, I think that engenders so much reverence, respect, responsibility, relationship, and those are the principles on which we can build a world that continues life, not destroys it.
Well, and one of the key ideas of this conference is that healing reciprocity happens. When that loving relationship gets going, we find solutions in it to some of the problems that we face. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Reciprocity is key, we know, to the functioning of ecosystems. We call them negative feedback loops, and we put a name like that on because, well, yeah, now we understand it. But we know we can't just take without giving, right? They haven't repealed the laws of thermodynamics on behalf of our species.
No corporation has been able to figure out how to do that.
That's right. Oh, they probably will try. You're right. You're right. Yeah. So that reciprocity really demands of us that we understand ourselves not just as consumers from the land, but as givers to the land. And I think that's one of the things that socially we have forgotten, culturally we have forgotten. I mean, heck, we're not even called citizens anymore. We're framed as consumers, right? But human beings can be givers too, and to remember that about ourselves is transformational.
It is. And if you look closely, human beings are doing that for each other already all the time. We just have to expand the circle.
Yes.
You invoked love, so I'm going to go there with Tom Fleischner's definition of natural history. The process of falling in love with the earth. Do you think that definition does it? Do you agree with that? As a natural historian yourself?
I think that is the subtext. That's it. We are in love with the world, and when we are in love, it's this ongoing loop. The more we love, the more we pay attention. The more we pay attention, the more you find to love. So absolutely, it is a process of falling in love with the world. But I think of it in particular as attention, and the notion that we pay attention. That's almost the only way we use that word, right? We pay attention, and we do, because we're not paying somewhere else. It's focused. It comes at a cost of energy and not looking at and investing in other things. And so to me, it is a very attentive and active kind of falling in love with the world, not a passive kind of love.
Which brings me to my final question.
Yeah.
And I asked you what you might want the average person to feel, but let's leave with something that you would say anyone can do to begin to take part in that active process of falling in love.
Be present. You know, when we think about falling in love, you have to have proximity. You have to be together. You have to be together. And so the first step, I think, to falling in love with the world is being there. Go outside. You don't have to go to the far mountaintop. You know, you can go to your backyard. You can go to a city park, and with eyes wide open, there is your beloved. So to me, it's being open and attentive and loving in the world. But I think it's also in that kind of active loving of really putting your hands in the earth. It is that physical engagement with the world. Plant something, eat something. You know, I teach ethnobotany, and the moment that I love in my classes is when you see people fall in love with the world. It's when they pick up something off from the ground and put it in their mouths, and it becomes part of them. It's a sensory experience of saying, whoa, this park, this path, this desert, this prairie is taking care of me. And that too really, I think, causes the love to just effervesce.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Effervescent love. Yes. Yes, please. Robin, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah.
What a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, good questions. Thank you. Yeah. Aren't we lucky?
Yes, we are. I will not argue with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.